Hey, welcome back, podcast friends. And today's episode is something that I really felt like I needed to tell you because this is something that actually was new to me. I never really even thought about this until my wife and I had gone to a conference, as a low carb Denver conference in Denver, Colorado. And I heard someone speak on this, and it's the first time I'd ever heard it. And then we ended up going to a metabolic health summit in Clearwater, Florida, and I heard about this again. And then since then, I've run across another article that talks about the same thing. And what I'm talking about is pre-diabetes. It's why and when did we start using the term pre-diabetes? And as I go through this, I'm not going to mention any names because, as important as the names are, it's not really that important. The main thing I want you guys to realize is the process, what actually has happened because of prediabetes. And the first thing I want you to know, remember, high blood sugar in diabetics, high blood sugar is a symptom. That is not what caused the disease. High blood sugar is a symptom of insulin resistance. And you get insulin resistance by keeping your blood sugars high for too long. And so your body's producing insulin, try to get rid of it. So your body becomes resistant to the insulin. And that's what keeps your blood glucose as high. So remember, all these things we're talking about is working on trying to decrease a symptom, not hitting the main problem of insulin resistance. If you've listened to any of my podcasts, you realize that the only way to truly treat type 2 diabetes is to change your nutrition. It's a nutrition problem that got you there. It's only nutrition that's going to get you better, because the way we use diabetic medications, they actually treat the symptom of lowering glucose, but they do it by making the disease worse because it's increasing your insulin when you already have insulin resistance. So I've talked about that in many of my podcasts. I just wanted to reiterate that here so you know that before I start going through this. So first, I think the very first thing that I really think is important is in the 1980s and 1990s, there wasn't a single new hypoglycemic medication produced, or a medication that will make you drop your blood glucose. And at that time, it's because, one, there weren't very many diabetic patients. So the drug companies didn't think it was going to be lucrative enough to make a diabetic medication. And then the other reason was because it was really doubtful whether lowering the blood glucose was really going to be of any benefit at all anyway. So nothing was changed until all of a sudden we started getting a growing number of diabetics. Our diabetic rate started getting higher and higher. And this happened right after around 1977 is when it really kind of started going up. And the reason for this was because that's when our diabetic, our food regulations changed, our dietary guidelines changed. Our dietary guidelines changed, telling everybody that eating animal meat and eating fat was bad and eating carbohydrates was good. So they started feeding everybody carbohydrates, which, if you listen to my past podcasts, you know that all carbohydrates, which are plant-based materials, which is what all man-made food is made out of, all carbohydrates get turned into glucose in your body. So if you have a trouble with glucose, the last thing you should be doing is putting more glucose in your body. And that's what the diabetic companies and food companies are telling you to do. Just keep eating your carbohydrates, just eat a little less of them. I'm saying that is a horrible advice. Okay. So that's one thing. The dietary guidelines changed and they started telling everybody that they needed to eat more carbohydrates. So that's the big thing. So prediabetes, this actually in 2001, there was a PR chief for the American Diabetic Association, the ADA, and they approached a group of these chief scientific medical officers, and they got about a half a dozen of these people to meet in a room at the NIH conference center in Bethesda, Maryland. Once they did this, all these people, they started thinking about what they can do, and what they decided to do. And this is in 2001. They decided to change the term. They used to use the term impaired fasting glucose, and they used to use the term impaired glucose tolerance. They decided to get rid of those two names and come up with a term called pre-diabetes. Okay. So pre-diabetes, this was a term they started to use. And then the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, they got together with some other people and they looked at all the dietary guidelines, and they decided that they wanted to reject this diagnostic category. They did not want to say that there was such thing as prediabetes. They said because using the term prediabetes makes it sound like you're automatically leading to diabetes if you don't change anything. And that's not necessarily the case. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But they also realized that the existing treatments really weren't helping any. And this is when John Yudkin, and I've talked about him earlier in one of my podcasts, in podcast number 25 on the history of processed food. John Yudkin was the main scientist that went up against Ansel Keys. And John Yudkin, Ansel Keys told everybody that it was fat that made everybody fat. And that's what the dietary guidelines were written off of. Even though later John Yudkin himself said, Ansel Keys himself said that he was wrong. But by then the wheels were turning so fast that there's no way he could knock it back. John Yudkin, on the other hand, said, no, it's sugar that causes the disease. That's what causes diabetes, is eating the sugar, which now we know that's exactly true. And all carbohydrates get broken down into sugar. So John Yudkin, he did that. He also wrote a book called Pure, White, and Deadly. But John Yudkin, when he heard this, they were trying to come up with this new diagnosis of prediabetes, he said that this was scaremongering. He knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to get more people on diabetic medications. That was the whole purpose. And remember, a diabetic medication works by increasing your insulin so your glucose goes down. But increased insulin is the problem in the first place. So after this, the CDC, they repeatedly stated before this that 15 to 30% of all patients with prediabetes goes on within 5 years to have diabetes. Okay, that's what they were telling everybody. No studies ever showed that. They never looked at it. So they were questioned about this. So the CDC did their own study and come to find out, instead of 15 to 30%, it's actually less than 2% per year of pre-diabetics going to be diabetics. And again, the reason why you're going to go from pre-diabetes to diabetes, again, because pre-diabetes isn't really a thing, is because you never change your nutrition habits. That's what causes you to go on, because your nutrition habits stay and you keep getting worse and worse and you continue to eat carbohydrates. Okay. That's one thing. But even that, it was way less than the 15 to 30% that they were telling them at the first time, at first. Now, the ADA and the CDC, these groups have spent billions of dollars trying to go through and trying to figure out what's going on and what they can do. And all their money was focused on two things: exercise and your carbohydrate intake, or your nutrition. And so what they were saying, they were telling everybody, keep eating this horrible man-made food that's full of glucose, just eat less of it. And at the same time, you need to exercise. That's what's going to get you healthy. So decrease your calories and exercise. That is the worst advice you can ever give anybody. And again, I've talked about this in past podcasts, so I'm not going to bore you with it, but that is horrible advice and it does not work. So before I go further, and I know this is kind of confusing, but it'll come to you. Before I go any further, I want to kind of explain the A1C, because this is another term. This is a diagnostic criteria. And what A1C is, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure if you're diabetic, you definitely know what A1C is. But an A1C means how much blood glucose has been attaching to a red blood cell over the last 3 to 4 months. And the reason it's 3 to 4 months is because that's the normal life cycle of a red blood cell. From the time it's made until it's destroyed is about 3 to 4 months. And they found that if they measure the amount of glucose that is attached to these red blood cells, that actually correlates to an actual average blood concentration of glucose that you've had over the last 3 to 4 months. Now, in 1955, that's when this was discovered. But in 1968, that's when they first noted that higher A1Cs were noted in diabetic patients. Then in 1976, that's when they started using the A1C actually in hospitals, when they were going to actually monitor type 2 diabetics and see what their blood glucoses were doing. Now, this is so important. If you don't get anything else, remember this. Back when I was going to school and all the way up until this time, till around 2001, a normal blood glucose, okay, an excellent blood glucose was anything from 6% or lower. If you had less than 6%, that's an excellent blood glucose. But if you had a blood glucose of 7% or 8%, you're still good. There's no problem. But they did find that an A1C above 9%, this is when they started seeing some problems with high blood glucoses. And then they were going to try to figure out how to do with that. Okay. So once again, blood glucoses less than 6 were excellent. Blood glucoses less than 8 were very, very good. And above 9, that's when you need to start worrying about it. Okay. That's very important because that changed everything. And the reason for that is because in 2001, the chief scientific and medical officer of the ADA, he got the original group together that came up with the term prediabetes. He got that group together and they looked at all this again. And at this time, the chief medical officer, when he saw what they were doing, he says that he is very upset. He basically, what he says, he rues the day that he helped promote the term pre-diabetes, calling it a big mistake. And the reason why he's calling this a big mistake is because in 2009, the American Diabetic Association and the European Association for the Study of Diabetes and the International Diabetes Federation, they all came together and they were trying to figure out what is a good A1C. What should we use as a good A1C? And at that time, they decided to say that 6% or higher was bad. Those are the ones that needed to be treated for diabetes. Okay. Now remember, it used to be 9% or higher. And 9%, that equates to an average blood glucose of about 215. Okay. Then they came to 6%. And 6%, it used to be if it was less than 6%, you're in the excellent range. But now they're saying 6% that's what they're going to need for preventative measures. However, this group unanimously rejected the term prediabetes, again, because they said that it doesn't really lead into diabetes and they don't know whether this is going to be a cure. So they didn't like using that term at all. And however, the ADA, the American Diabetic Association, from the same meeting, they went the exact opposite way. Instead of saying that they weren't going to use the term prediabetes, they cranked it down. So instead of saying that an A1C of 6 or higher needed to be treated, now they cranked it down and say, no, an A1C of 5.7 needs to be treated. And remember, anything less than 6 was excellent blood glucose control before the drug companies got involved in all this, and the American Diabetic Association and many other companies, as you'll see. So the ADA, they kept the term prediabetes and they lowered it to 5.7 as the range that you need to keep it. And this, just by lowering this range, so when you go in the doctor and you get an A1C and your A1C comes back at 6, which used to be excellent, now they're saying you need medication, they're going to give you medication for it. And again, the medication actually makes the diabetes worse. So the ones that stimulate insulin, which that's most of the diabetic medications. Because of this created 72 million more potential diabetic patients. And that's just in the United States alone. If you look worldwide, there was hundreds of millions of new diabetic patients who could be using these diabetic medications. And this was a huge increase. But now this came along and now food companies jumped on board. Their food companies were saying, oh, we want an FDA seal of approval on our food to say that our food will decrease diabetes. There's no way you can do that because it's the man-made food that's getting all the people on become type 2 diabetics in the first place, because they're all carbohydrate based and carbohydrates get turned into glucose. So that was nuts, but that's what the food companies are doing. And I'm sure there's food out there that says that it's ADA approved for diabetes. That doesn't mean it's true. Then the fitness industry, they jumped on board too, because we're telling everybody the only way to get this off, get your weight off, is to exercise. So the fitness companies are going crazy. They're making millions of dollars. Now the CGM, the continuous glucose monitors, those came along. And just by having these new continuous glucose monitors, which I'm all for, I'm not against the glucose monitors. It just, you need to know what you're monitoring. You need to know what your actual ranges should be. But they say that just because of this, they've added another 25 million customers in the last 12 years to say that these patients are diabetic. And this doesn't even include other big countries like China. You know, there's a lot of people being treated for pre-diabetes with diabetic drugs that's going to make them going to be diabetics that should never have been on them in the first place. So the big questions, the big conflicts, there's two big questions. One of them is how often and how quickly does pre-diabetes progress into diabetes? Okay. They at that time, they hadn't done the study. And then they also wonder, does choosing to give medication for prediabetes, does that actually cause harm? Or does prediabetes itself, if you have prediabetes, does that cause harm? And the answer is no. If you have their guidelines of prediabetes of now it's 5.7 to 6.4, that's the range they say. If you have a range of that, you were considered excellent range. So obviously, no, being in the pre-diabetic range that they came up with does not lead to diabetes. It should not be being treated, depending on all the other situations, the other health issues that you're having at the time. Um, However, the other thing is there was a comprehensive study back in 2018. And in 2018, there was a review of 103 studies, all the bunch of studies put together of the Cochrane Library in London. And at that time, they said up to 59% of pre-diabetes patients actually returned to normal A1C levels, normal diabetes range within 11 years without doing anything at all. No intervention at all. And over half the patients automatically returned to a normal range. And again, this is going to be determined by what types of food they ate. Then there came all the drug options. And this is when things got crazy because all the drug companies were racing to try to get all these medications. Remember in the 1980s and 1990s, there wasn't a single new drug for diabetes. And now there are a lot of drugs for diabetes. So drug companies would get in there because they were wanting to start treating all these new patients that they said had pre-diabetes. The Federal Registry, clinicaltrials.gov, says that there are more than 100 drugs, supplements, and other remedies, including devices, including gastric bands that they're given to these patients that are calling prediabetes to try to help them, from not becoming diabetics. And the drug makers and the ADA and others of the federal trials, they have at least 10 different classes of drugs that right now are being given to our pre-diabetic patients. And remember, the other thing is there's never been a study that shows by giving these medications or these things to pre-diabetics that it keeps it from going on to diabetes. So anytime you be given a medication for pre-diabetes, that's being off-label, meaning there's been no studies that show that you should do that. And it's really kind of weird that you would think that what they're saying is if you have whether you have pre-diabetes, what they call pre-diabetes, or if you have diabetes, we're going to give you the same medication. It doesn't make sense. In fact, a member of the WHO, the World Health Organization, made the statement, it seems counterintuitive to take a medicine in order to prevent something for which you would take that medicine. And that's exactly true. It is counterintuitive. It is. The main reason is money. And you'll see that in just a little bit. The other thing I really want you guys to remember is all medications have adverse effects. All medications have adverse effects. They're going to fix one thing and they're going to mess a lot of things up. And I'm not saying don't take medications if you're on them. I'm saying beware that if you change your nutrition and give your body the nutrition it needs, most of these medications, especially ones for diabetes, most of these medications could be eliminated totally, either decreased in dose or eliminated totally. And it all depends on how serious you get about your nutrition. But all medications, and especially diabetic medications, there are a ton of adverse effects, including congestive heart failure with some of them. And some of them, like the big GLP-1 agonists that everybody's doing with the Ozempic or the semaglutide, all those GLP-1 agonists, they also have the big black box warning that says that they can cause thyroid cancer. So be very careful of all this stuff. And John Yuckin, which I just talked about, he also says that this is crazy. Besides the scaremongering, what it's doing is it's giving everybody this false sense of urgency that they have to hurry up and get out there and get that A1C down, when previously they were in the perfect range to begin with. But like I said, the main reason for this is because of financial conflicts. That's why they came up with the term prediabetes. That's why they keep dropping the A1C lower and lower, because they get more and more people. And the financial conflicts I'm talking about is the people who study ethics. Okay, the people who study, the ethicists, what they do is they have criticized the American Diabetic Association for financial dependence on its diabetes drug makers. The American Diabetic Association says it's received $18 million to $27 million annually from drug companies. And this including many donations of $500,000 to $1 million per year. The American Diabetic Association also gets up to $500,000 annually from each of more than a dozen other firms in the diabetes and prediabetes markets, including makers of the medical products, drugs, testing labs, insurance companies, and all the drug retailers. Okay. There is a lot of money going on here. The American College of Physicians rated the ADA, the American Diabetic Association's conflict of interest, among the most extreme. It says the ADA representative stated that and this is funny because even though there's been 27 million, all these millions of dollars being given to them, there is an ADA representative that states that the funders have no influence over the final outcome of the ADA's work or the research. And we all know that that is a lie. Anytime, and that's been proven over and over again. This is not me. This has been proven. Anytime somebody funds a study, that study almost always goes in the favor of the person who's doing the funding. That's just the way it is. And since the 2000s, this has become very, very, very evident as all these drug companies are funding all these studies or doing actually, they're doing the studies themselves now, which is a whole nother thing. And I just talked about that in the podcast as well. But the American College of Physicians, even though they say this is a conflict of interest, the ADA they're still doing this. And there's one man who his paper discussed a wide range of drugs and prediabetes. And this man's papers that he's written has been cited more than 3,000 times. And his papers are discussing this wider range. He has gotten $5 million personally. He's gotten $5 million from diabetes drug makers, including $1.3 million in fees paid directly to him just for consulting, advice, and travel. Okay. So this is from, well, I won't even tell you where it's from, but he's also very influential in the papers that they're distributing out to all the physicians and everybody, telling them what to use. But there's one person who served on the ADA standards panel, and he received the most during that period. This one man from the American Diabetic Association standards panel got $6.8 million, including $123,000 in consulting and travel fees. And about 5.3 million of this came from makers of the drugs. So the drug companies are giving them all this money to go out and tell everybody that they need to have these A1Cs down and they need to start treating these pre-diabetes, which is a made-up term. Now, this money also comes from a combination of two different sources. This money comes because of the expanded definition of what diabetes is or pre-diabetes is. The lower you make the A1C, the more normal people you can say are sick, and you can start giving them this medication. And then also it's the direct endorsements to the people who wrote the diabetic guidelines, like we were just talking about. So according to a diabetic clinician at the Mayo Clinic, this expanded pre-diabetes definition, it says that this is a financial win for physicians, companies that conduct lab tests, drug companies, device and app developers, clinics, and hospitals. The only people who lose by these new guidelines are the poor people who are actually healthy people, have a normal A1C like they've always said before 2001. They have normal, and now these people are considered being sick. So now they're going in for checkups, they're going in for tests, they're going on treatments, or started on all these diabetic drugs. And again, most of the diabetic drugs work by lowering your sugar by increasing your insulin, which makes your insulin resistance worse. That's why they continue to add more and more medications, keep increasing your doses, and tell you that this is a long-term, this is a chronic disease, and you will always be on medication. That is a lie. If you go that route, that is true. But if you change your nutrition, you can totally reverse and get rid of type 2 diabetes, because it's always been known that this was a nutrition disease, not a disease that you have to have a medication for. This just came about, again, since 2009 when these people came up with these new guidelines. So remember, You could stay out of this whole mess, all this mess, all this money, everything. You could totally stay out of this mess if you just change your nutrition. Just eat God-made food, which means real animal meat, real fruits, real vegetables, and totally avoid all this man-made food that's totally made up of nothing but carbohydrates and all these plant-based foods that's making your glucoses go higher, making your insulin become resistant, and putting more and more fat, because all glucose gets turned over into fat. So be very, very aware of what's going on. I really hope you guys understand how important this is. And um, the other thing, nobody in the medical field is telling type 2 diabetics that this condition can be totally treated by food. Nobody's telling them that. I mean, there are some people, but in general, they're not. And physicians can't tell you that because they have to go by the clinical guidelines. It just so happens the clinical guidelines are being written by the American Diabetic Association and the makers of these drug companies. So the people who are writing the clinical drug guidelines are the ones who's telling physicians how to treat diabetes, and they cannot go against clinical guidelines. So again, this isn't up to your physician to do this. You need to change your nutrition on yourself, by yourself. And this reminds me of a couple things that I've heard a lot here lately, and it's perfect for this. But one thing that it seems like all these drug companies are going by is that if there's a disease or condition that is cured, is a customer lost. And that's how they're looking at this. They want more and more customers. That's how they make their living. They're a business. They aren't after your health. Actually, they are after your health. They want to make you more sick, because that's how they keep the revenue going up, because they want to make sure that everybody realizes that they have a pill to cure your every ill. And I am trying to tell you that is not true. And again, I've been a clinical pharmacist for over 30 years. I know what medications do. I know how they act. I know how they work in your body. And I know all the serious adverse effects. There are some conditions that need medications. However, no matter what condition you have, you will never, ever, ever go wrong by giving your body the nutrients it needs. It's been taking care of itself for centuries with the proper nutrients. It's just since our new dietary guidelines came out that we quit giving our body nutrients, and we're just giving them these carbohydrates over and over and over with all this man-made food. All man-made food, including infant milk or infant formulas and baby food. All man-made food is made of 3 ingredients. It's ultra-processed carbohydrates, it's vegetable and seed oils, and it's sugar and high fructose corn syrup. And all 3 of those are extremely detrimental to your health. So if you can avoid those, stick with God-made food, you will be so much better off. So I just thought that was something you needed to know. Like I said, I didn't even realize it. I've been using the term pre-diabetes. I didn't realize this was a made-up term to try to get more people on medications. But since I've heard it 3 times now, and actually saw it in writing, besides the 2 talks that I heard, it makes perfect sense. And so I just wanted everybody here to be aware of it also. So get into a conversation with the doctor if he wants to put you on a diabetic medication when you have this normal A1C. And remember, the old guidelines that we've always gone by up until this time, the old guidelines were anything less than 6% was excellent blood glucose range. Anything less than 8%, you're still in the good range. In the 7 to 8%, you're still in good. But if your A1C is greater than 9, then that's when you might start thinking about nutrition changes. But I honestly would tell you, do not wait till it's that high. Even if you're in this range, you need to be taking care of your diabetes or your high blood sugars with nutrition. That is the way you're going to get rid of it. So anyway, I know I'm becoming a broken record, so I won't keep repeating myself, but I hope you learned something from this. I definitely did. And for now, I just want to thank you so much for listening, and have a great week. And remember, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life.